Hello, and welcome to another episode of Such a Nightmare, Conversations About Horror. My name is Katherine Troyer, and joining me, as usual, is Anthony Tresca.
Hey there!
But what is not per usual is that this very spooktacular episode we are joined by the author, Paul Tremblay.
Hey, glad to be here for the spooktacular.
Yes. So, if you are listening to this episode, you probably already know who Paul Tremblay is because he's the reason you're listening. But Anthony and I were particularly excited because, hands down, one of my favorite books, period, not even just in horror, period, is 2015's A Head Full of Ghosts.
And likewise, The Cabin at the End of the World from 2018, just one of my all-time favorite horror texts. Love it so much.
Thank you. This is the best podcast ever.
Yay, the end. And we've taught Head Full of Ghosts. We will be teaching Cabin at the End of the Woods, Cabin at the End of the World. Sorry.
Everybody does that, myself included.
And, we just need to have another version so that we can also teach 2020 Survivor Song.
All right.
So now we're going to jump straight into it. This is going to be an unedited interview. We've given Paul the questions ahead of time, so he's more or less had some time to look over it and maybe prepared a thought or two. So if you want to go ahead and kick us off, Katie.
Yes. So the first question is, what is one uninteresting fact about you?
I verified with Lisa that this was, in fact, very uninteresting. But my second toe is longer than my big toe.
Oh. On both feet? Okay.
Yeah, on both feet. Yeah. That would be interesting if it was just 1 foot, I think.
At least you are outwardly consistent with it.
Yes.
Yeah, that definitely counts as an uninteresting fact. Thank you.
Now that we've got that uninteresting fact out of the way, let's briefly talk about some of your most memorable and formative experiences with horror. Something that, given that you're a horror writer, is probably important.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess I'll break it up a little, like time-wise. So as a child, really for me, I wasn't sort of embarrassed to admit that I really wasn't a big reader as a child or even a teenager. I mean, I was a good student. I would do what the teachers asked me to do, but I wasn't reading for pleasure. I was really, I don't know, I was a teenager in the 80s, so I would come home, cable was relatively new, and I would just watch TV all the time. So for me, my first horror and the earliest formative horror experiences were all films. Where I grew up just outside of Boston, there was this was when I was really young, probably, ages 7, 8, 9. There was a program called Creature Double Feature where every Saturday they would show two movies in a row. The first movie was always Godzilla or Gamera, and that's what was the hook for me. And then the second movie would be a scarier horror movie. Usually like, black and white exploitation kind of films, like Attack of the Giant Killer Shrews, Attack of the Colossal Man, anything with attack in the title. And those like terrified me, gave me nightmares. Seeing Jaws when I was 10 or 11 definitely scarred me for life. As much as I love that movie as an adult, I mean, I'm not exaggerating. I've probably seen it 50 times, but I've only seen Quint get bitten in half once. It was the first time I saw it. So even now when I watch it, I cover my face with a pillow, which is kind of makes it equally horrific because I'm just listening to Quint screaming. Reading wise, the formative experience for me was I was a math. I started off a math education major as an undergrad, and through uninteresting series of events, I had to drop the education part of it and became a double major of math humanities. My second semester senior year, I took essentially Lit 101 or English 101 class, because most of my other humanities classes were like history, philosophy, etc. I don't know, in that class I had sort of the stereotype of the professor you really bond with. He was a big punk music fan, and I was too, so I really sort of identified with him over that. But I'll never forget in that course. Well, we read 2 short stories that I wrote a paper on. One was T.C. Boyle's Greasy Lake. and he's not really considered a horror writer, but it's a very dark story. But the other story was, which is a great story, but the other one was life-changing for me, and it was Joyce Carol Oates's "Where Are You Going? Where Have You Been?" And I'll never forget reading that story and like sort of like discovering it's like, oh, I didn't know people wrote things like this. And on the heels of that, I mentioned Lisa before. She was my girlfriend at the time, and now she's my wife. But she bought me Stephen King's The Stand for my 22nd birthday. So I inhaled that. And when I went off to graduate school for math for 2 years, I was also reading all the King books. And from King, I went to, with the help of Danse Macabre, that book, I discovered Peter Straub and, Shirley Jackson and Clive Barker, et cetera. So I don't know, that's a lot of formatives, but those are all the formatives, I guess.
No, that sounds terrific. Anthony and I actually like poured over that list in Danse Macabre there at the end, where he's like, here are the ones you should read. And we're like, okay, we have to put these in somehow. And I don't know if you had a chance to read The House Next Door by Anne River Siddons, but that one was one that I'd never heard of until reading Danse Macabre.
And he talks about it in comparison to The Haunting of Hill House, and it's a beautiful section in that book. And then the book itself it's up there with my favorite horror books of all time.
Oh, okay. I'll definitely have to check it out.
So is there a horror text that if someone were to say, oh, I haven't watched or read that you would just like tell people to clear their schedule and like make time to experience whatever that text is like right away?
Sure. Yeah, I guess I'll go with a more recent one for a book, but it's a book I've been talking about for a few years now because it's one of my favorite short story collections of this century. Is Things We Lost in the Fire by Mariana Enriquez. She's an Argentinian writer. I think the book came out probably going on 2 years now, maybe even 3. But it's such a wonderful collection. And the range of stories. So the opening story, The Dirty Kid, is one of the most disturbing, creepy stories I've ever read. And it's hard to describe without giving away too much. But the story sort of opens where this woman, she moved away from her family and she's really living in this, purposely in a sketchy part of the city, and she knows this. And every night there's this kid sleeping outside of her apartment building on a mattress, and the mother is there, but then sort of not there, and she's trying to help the kid out, and then things sort of just go horribly from there. But it's just such a well-written story, and all of her stories are so well-written, and every story in that collection is different. Like she has a ghost story, she definitely has a lot of socio-political horror stories dealing with what's going on in Argentina. Stories about gender. She even has like a Lovecraftian story that's just really amazing. So I can't recommend that collection enough. And for movies, I proselytize openly for Lake Mungo, which is one of my favorite movies. It's one of the few movies that I own 2 copies of the DVD, one that I can always have in my person, and the other one to lend out to people.
Wow.
My novel After Head Full of Ghosts, Disappearance at Devil's Rock is definitely, Lake Mungo inspired in many ways.
Yeah, I was reading somewhere that you said that it was inspired by a couple of different Australian horror films.
Yeah. There were 3. Also, I think Stuart Onan's Songs for the Missing, that was a good, text to read too. That's not horror, but it really gets into what happens when someone goes missing. But the 3 Australian movies, Lake Mungo, the title is a riff on Picnic at Hanging Rock. And there's another Australian movie called Snowtown Murders. It's the kind of it's a brilliant movie, but it's the kind of movie you can only watch once because it's just so disturbing. Based on real life, sort of serial killer-ish kind of thing. And it's an amazing movie, but yeah, it's a tough watch.
Yeah, we definitely know a few of those.
Yeah, one of the early films that I decided to randomly show Anthony was the French film Martyrs. I don't know if and I was like, just watch this. I'm not telling you anything about it. In retrospect, I should have prepared him a little bit more than that.
Yeah, you made me watch it over my lunch break. I was eating
in that
film.
Yeah, I have to admit, I haven't had the courage to watch it. Everyone raves about it. I have a hard time with like super gory stuff. Really affects me. I'm sure it's a brilliant movie, but yeah, I haven't been able to bring myself to do it.
I was writing a paper looking at it, so I had to like watch some of those scenes over and over, and I was like, this is not what I meant to do with myself.
Well, I think that your last response leads us into our next question a little bit. You talked a little bit about how that more of the body humor and gore kind of freaks you out, but what else scares you in real life, and how do those fears play into your own writing?
I mean, I guess it seems trite to say I'm afraid of everything, but I mean, I don't know. I guess, I'm sort of like, I think maybe writers in general, not even horror writers, we're just always spinning through worst case scenarios. And, that's probably just how I deal with things. I will say that I won't take as long as I did to answer the question before about formative experiences, but as a kid, I was definitely, full card carrying scaredy cat, like afraid of the dark. Everything scared me. I slept with like a fortress of stuffed animals around my head to protect me from assorted monsters in the room. So I don't know. I mean, and that's like when you look back on it, that's sort of like a fun, quaint fear, So there's still that horror appeal on that part of it, where it sort of feels like that part of it can feel roller coasty a little bit. Like we're in the moment, you're terrified, but afterwards you can sort of laugh at it. That's still there, but obviously then the more adult fears sort of came in. And for me in the 80s, the first adult fear was, fear of dying in a nuclear war. Was something I obsessed over, especially when I got into my high school years. And then those, I had those nightmares, which were a lot less fun. Not that the other like monster nightmares were fun too, but those are easier to laugh off in the light of day as opposed to the other ones. I think obviously an abiding sort of interest or, quote unquote fear in my novels, at least, this recent crop of novels has been, fears of parenting and anxieties related to that. I think when I wrote A Head Full of Ghosts, when I started, I was like, oh, this is going to be in response to the Exorcist and possession stories, and then eventually horror in general. And then when I started writing Disappearance at Devil's Rock, I was like, oh, this is in some ways not like A Head Full of Ghosts, but it's another family, a single mother this time. And by the time I got to Cabin, I was like, this is all right. This is going to be like, I knew going in, I want to have like a nice, it wasn't a trilogy of books, but I thought it was a cool 3-book, if not an arc, but at least 3 different ways or 3 different types of families and 3 different ways of exploring the, ambiguous fears in that too. And I guess the last abiding fear, a holdover from my 80s fear of nuclear war, is just the fear of that, I'm going to live to see the end of the world. Is definitely something that comes up a lot in my fiction. Obviously, Cabin at the End of the World. But I had a short story collection in 2010 called In the Meantime. I think like 10 out of the 13 stories all dealt with the apocalypse or in the midst of an apocalypse or right before it happened kind of thing.
So I also have big fears about that because I was raised pretty conservatively. So it felt like at every other like church meeting it'd be like end of times. Is that where the fear kind of sparked for you, or did it just kind of emerge through more unexplained?
Yeah, I think it emerged more, through the 80s. I mean, my parents were briefly Catholic, I would say. I made it to like first confession, 7 years old, but that was like the last time. Although I've been sort of in and around Catholic institutions my whole life, which is kind of weird, as a teacher and even as a student. So no, I can't blame religion on that one for me. It was just more, in the 80s. I mean, it was just everywhere, even in the pop culture, like movies like, always like The Dead Zone, but War Games. I think that came out in 1984. I was obsessed with that movie, War Games, the Matthew Broderick one, right, where the computer finally figures out that you can't win, and even though they sort of hacked into whatever the hell the system is called. I was going to call it Skynet, but that's a different movie. That's the Terminator. And now I mean, just as an adult, with a parent, and a parent, obviously just worrying about climate change, and now we have the fun pandemic, but before that it was more climate change and everything else that could possibly go wrong.
Digging into that a little bit, do you think that your fear of seeing the world end and everything go wrong around you has made you better or more ill prepared for this current pandemic that's going on right now?
Oh yeah, ill prepared. In mid-March, when my school in Massachusetts really first went into lockdown, it sort of coincided with my 2-week spring break anyway. So I wasn't teaching from home. I had 2 weeks at home, and I was sort of in a metaphorical fetal position, just on the couch watching Animal Planet and Mythbusters, and I really couldn't deal. That was those 2 weeks seemed like it lasted for everybody. I think like a year.
Do you think there's a horror world that you would survive?
No. Well, my initial response was no. Obviously, it wouldn't be a zombie apocalypse. I've never shot a gun in my life, so I wouldn't be prepared for that. I mean, unless like the zombies, like if I could hit them with a basketball, because I'm a good shot in basketball. But so actually, what I eventually wrote down is I think if it was sort of like a werewolf thing or a vampire thing, where like the tropey rules were in place, like I think I could avoid a werewolf. If it's just a full moon, I think I could stay away from the area or barricade myself somewhere. I'm not going to go after them. And same thing, if it was like the old school sort of vampires, just get some garlic. But yeah, I think those are the only, as long as there's like rules like that, I think that's my only chance.
So moving away a little bit from horror and the abstract in our real world, let's talk a little bit about your experience as a writer. I wonder specifically, you could start off by just saying one like particularly gratifying experience for you as a writer to date.
Oh yeah, I'm like most of these questions, like I can't. It's hard just to give just one. Honestly, for like personally, like something where I felt proud of something I did. It's really related to A Head Full of Ghosts, because my first 2 books with a major publisher were sort of like dark, quirky detective novels, and for a variety of reasons that were not my fault, they didn't sell very well, and that really, I don't know, knocked me on my writer's butt for a good, 3, almost 4 years, where I had a hard time writing, and I spent a lot of time. Like I'm thankful at least I didn't do this like online, but in my own head I was very bitter and jealous, and I don't know, I had to learn the hard way that jealousy is the mind killer, is the page killer. Nothing good comes from it. But I had to come through that on my own to be able to write A Head Full of Ghosts. And I think I don't think it's any coincidence just for me, like my own like head in writing that. Once I let go of all that stuff, I was open to that. I was open for a story like that to land in my lap, and I was able to do it. So I'm proud of myself for, I guess, just coming through the other side. Other fun stuff, obviously, just Stephen King reading and liking the books is a definite highlight. It's amazing. The people I've been able to meet that I wouldn't have met otherwise. That includes readers and writers and editors and other people like that, and musicians. Like I'm a big music nerd, and I don't know, I playfully stalk my favorite musicians with my writing, and I don't know, I've become friends with like some really cool bands that I've liked and admired. So that's been a highlight too.
You wouldn't happen to be able to share a couple of those band names that you've befriended?
Oh sure. So I tend to like punk, heavier music. So a band from the 90s called Helmet. Page Hamilton is the lead guitarist, singer, and he was actually probably the first one that, you find out that so many of these people are big readers. Like I named my collection I mentioned In the Meantime after Helmet's second album, Meantime. So I sent him a copy of the book, never thinking I'd hear from him. But yeah, no, we've become friends, hung out. Like even like Lisa, me and the kids have gone to Page's house in LA once. It was pretty cool. I've been to shows and he takes me backstage. Another band that's been around since the 90s, they're still going strong, is a band called Clutch. They started off as sort of like hardcore and become more like, rock and roll. Like Neil Fallon, again, is a huge reader. He's more a science fiction reader. Like he used to read like, I think the Nebula slate every year. But he's been very cool, very nice guy. British band called the Future of the Left / McCluskey. Andy Falkus is the lead singer. I met him because in one of the epigraphs of A Head Full of Ghosts is from a Future of the Left song. And so we just stayed in touch and met and hit it off, and yeah. So I don't know. It's just I love music, but I also just love, for me, like what I get out of it, just helps recharge my batteries, being able to, whether it's music or writing, to, just either share the struggle kind of thing or, or just be goofy and hang out. There's still something about being able to do that with another creative that, I don't know, helps me like recharge the batteries and, makes me more likely to sit down and try writing after, working a full day at work.
Yeah. Very cool. Anthony, I know the next question was one that you had wanted to ask, and I kind of put us out of order. Do you want to ask, or do you want me to?
No, go ahead.
Okay.
You're making the test harder.
Yeah, I know. That's right. We're switching things up. No, so one of the many, many things that we have talked about on the podcast, also just kind of between the two of us, that we enjoy about your writing is that your books seem to be exploring horror from almost this sort of meta level. And you're, building but also deconstructing these specific subgenres. You talked about that with Head Full of Ghosts, that it was, a direct sort of awareness of the possession narrative, but you've also had the end of the world sort of a subgenre, the post-apocalyptic. So looking at like your reader's notes where you talk about, all the little like puzzles you set for yourself and all that stuff, why do you enjoy playing with horror in these ways?
Yeah, it's a really good question. In some ways, it's kind of hard to answer. Although, I guess what I would say is, I don't know, for the novels especially. Sorry for the delay. For the novels especially, I don't know. My default is to try to like play it as realistic as I think it can be. In the short stories, and part of that maybe it's just because of my own innate agnostic / atheist for most of my waking time, not all of it. Because if I get into a big long story, it's like, that, would that really happen? I mean, so that sort of maybe goes to explain some of the ambiguity, but not all of it. But I don't know, like, I guess I'm really interested in like, how could this really happen? Like, since I'm afraid of so many different things, like, how could we really have, a possession story that would seem realistic? Obviously I never answered the question whether or not she's possessed, but I felt like this is what would happen if it was a case that looked like it really would be, possession, that there would be some sort of reality TV crew involved. And so when I approach it from, but I also want to approach it from a way that, so there's that. I also want to approach it from, and try to give the readers credit. Like, they've read, even if they've never read horror before, just by being a person aware of the culture, they're going to know so many of these tropes just from being around. And so, I have a really difficult, I think it becomes partly meta just because I want to show to the readers, like, hey, I know, like, without getting jokey, like, I don't want to be Scream, not that Scream is a bad movie. Like, I'm not trying to write like a horror comedy. I want it to be real and quote unquote serious. So I'm trying to balance, like, I know what has come before, and maybe trying to find my own way to put some sort of twist on it that makes it seem, if not new again, nothing's, I guess, ever really new again, but at least fresh in some way. And I don't know, and we live in a postmodern world. I mean, it's, the idea that we are daily questioning. I mean, just this weekend, like with, Trump testing for COVID, like all these people, like wouldn't, I'm on the side of, science and the party of rational choices. But even like people sort of on my side of the political fence were like right away, oh no, he's, instant conspiracy theory. Oh no, he's not, he's not actually sick. This, and this. And I know it just continually blows me away how we are living in like postmodern society. We're certainly a post-truth society or a post-information society. I don't know, where like everything is questioned all the time, every day, and it's exhausting. So, I mean, all that stuff definitely gets thrown in, particularly in with A Head Full of Ghosts. Actually, the 4 novels, I'd say all 4 definitely have those sort of how can we trust anything that's going on sort of anxieties in there.
Yeah. That really comes out, particularly, I think, in Survivor Song, your most recent one, particularly seems like a comment on that postmodern world that we're all forced to live in, and that you seem to identify based on my reading, you attribute a lot of it to technology and that escalation of it, which is very
thank you. Yeah, it's funny because with that book, like in going into it, I'm like, I know I can't do ambiguous horror all the time. I was happy to do it for the 3 novel arc that I sort of discussed. but like I never want to just put it in there to have it be my thing or to be a gimmick. It has to be part and parcel of the theme. I mean, it has to be the theme really of the book for it to be there. So when I was writing Survivor Song, I was like, oh, this is not an ambiguous book. It's going to have an ending. Although I tried to playfully pretend there was an ambiguous ending for those that have read it. But I mean, like, as you said, Anthony, some of it sneaks in, just the idea that, on the Facebook page, you can recognize like some of those comments, but at the same time, it goes to reflect, our current anxiousness given like the amount of misinformation that's being spewed at us.
Yeah. I wonder if you couldn't go a little bit deeper. You were already kind of touching on this a little bit in the previous question, but what specifically do you keep in mind when you're crafting these characters that have to exist within the horror framework, but also these real life situations?
Yeah, so for the characters, it's weird. I mean, honestly, a lot of it, I go off of feel. Like, I think that's one of the biggest steps for younger writers. It's the hardest, is learning to like trust your subconscious. But also learning when to sort of wrestle something into place. I mean, I can't point to when you're supposed to do it. It just comes through feel a little bit. So generally with my characters, I mean, with the exception of maybe Redmond, if that's his real name, in Cabin, and, with the exception of, some of the pseudo militia guys in Survivor Song, I try to approach every character from a place of empathy. And empathy to me isn't important for any fiction writer. I mean, I take that job seriously because as an educator, there are reams of studies that study like people who read fiction tend to be able to be more empathetic to people who aren't them or who don't look like them. And I don't know, I take that as a call to arms for fiction writers. That's what you should be doing. It should be empathy over sympathy. Nothing makes me like dismiss someone's opinion faster than, oh, I didn't like that character, or I couldn't sympathize with that character. You're not supposed to. Sympathy is easy. Sympathy is rooting for the home team. Sympathy is why we're in the mess we're in. Sympathy is, oh, that person looks and talks and acts like me, so that's why I like them. No, empathy is what makes some of us human. Empathy is, the want to understand someone else, even if they're doing something we find distasteful or even villainous, like, but still we want to understand like how they got there and how we might have ended up in that same spot. So I don't know, almost all my characters have, I'll pose them sort of the story questions that I pose myself first. And then at some point in the book, they become their own characters in some ways, but there's still like a little piece of me asking the same questions, and maybe it's just a different part of me that is doing what they're doing now, kind of thing.
Well, I can tell you as a reader, I definitely have the feels. Every time I read one of your books, I'm like, I feel in the best way possible raw inside, because I can't just separate it, as fluff, right? Like it's making me be a human in the best way possible. So you are definitely keep going with your gut, because it is 100% working.
Thank you. Yeah, my editor used to joke I was Mr. Ambiguous Horror, but now we're calling it sad horror. I write sad horror. Yeah, sure.
I was actually thinking that you did kind of deserve your own genre, like haunting instead of horror, because it's different, but in a way that I think is really good, which actually leads me to our next question. So we talk a lot in our podcast about this framework that was crafted by a scholar named Linda Holland Toll, and she said that you can really kind of see on a continuum disaffirmative horror and affirmative horror. And she says that affirmative horror ends up at the end of the day showing that because the systems have been threatened, but at the end of the day we triumph and overachieve and achieve greatness, that the structure is not the problem, the threat on the outside is. Whereas just disaffirmative horror lifts the curtain, that sheet up, and it's like, see that body, see that monster, that is you. You are the monster. So where would you place, and it may be different for different books of yours, but where would you place your horror on this framework in terms of, you've already said that horror should make us empathize, but what else should it do as it's engaging with its audience?
Yeah, I'll back up a little bit and say, I mean, what I do is I try to start from empathy. I mean, I think the cool thing about horror is there's so many ways you can do it, right? You can still be successful, and you don't have to have empathy clearly for all the characters. Like a film like Get Out, obviously, we're not supposed to have empathy for, the white people that live in that town because they're representative of an oppressive society, right? I'm not as talented as obviously, Jordan Peele. So like, I kind of have to stick with what I do. I thought a lot about this question. I liked the words too, the affirmative versus disaffirmative, because that's close to how I wrote a little essay that was in the paperback of A Head Full of Ghosts, talking about progressive versus conservative horror. And I don't necessarily mean it's, horror written by, Democrats or written by, Republicans. It was more just in how the essence to me of a horror story is that there's some truth revealed, and it's usually obviously it's a horrible truth of some kind. And to me, progressive horror, so I guess in this case, we're probably more leaning towards disaffirmative, but in my mind, progressive horror represents the truth after the horror truth has been revealed, but the truth that nothing stays the same, everything's going to change. So, in the movie The Exorcist and the book The Exorcist, for example, obviously, one of the scariest movies and books, in the genre, but at the same time, I think there's maybe failing is too strong a word, but I think sort of the post end doesn't work because, it is such a conservative in story structure or reactionary story structure, whereas the status quo is restored at the end of the movie. Reagan doesn't even remember anything. In the movie, it's like everyone's sunny and happy. It's like, no, if they went through this, they would be fundamentally changed by everything that happened to them. So I don't know, I tend to judge horror by, the change part of it. Like, even as the twist ending, like something like The Lottery, for example, the twist at the end, sort of what the change part of it comes from, like how you view the rest of the story that came before it. That's a very disaffirmative horror story, because I mean the twist is really the reveal of the horrible truth that what this town is doing to itself. So yeah, I don't know. So I mean, I guess what I'm saying is I think more of in terms of like my big reveal I try to make come like at the 2/3 point. At least with the ambiguous novels, we'll call them. I tried to have that happen. And then, for each one, I was like, oh, so what are they going to do now? Like, I mean, that's why I wanted to write A Head Full of Ghosts, was I wanted the attempted exorcism to happen like the 2/3 point. And then I really wanted to dig in as what are they going to do after that? Like, that's really interesting to me. You don't really see that in any of the movies. I mean, you maybe see like the 30 seconds afterwards or 2 minutes afterwards, but you don't get like a whole act after that. I don't know, that's really long and rambly, but that's the best I can do with that question.
If you don't mind me asking a bit of a maybe probing question,
sure,
about that answer. Katie has made the claim that affirmative horror can't be nearly as satisfying as disaffirmative horror on the podcast. And you seem to be getting at it a similar way in how you talked about how The Exorcist is more of an example of what was your word again? Progressive and progressive and yeah, I guess conservative. Did they call it reactionary? Yeah, or reactionary. Yeah. And do you think that is also the same? That conservative type of horror is not as satisfying as progressive horror, where that trauma forces you to change?
Well, look, I mean, I certainly can't speak for everybody. I can only speak for me. I mean, there are plenty of people out there who love seeing the monster defeated and everyone happy at the end. That's just not me. It rings hollow, and I don't know. Maybe that means I can't read for escape. And I'm not trying to say that people who can, there's something wrong with them. It's just not me. Like, I don't read for escape. I read to be myself, if that makes sense. it's not to say like I don't like Evil Dead 2 was one of my favorite movies, but I think there's some really subversive stuff happening in that movie. Even insofar as like how it's being presented to us visually. So, I mean, I don't want to just say blanket statement doesn't work, but I mean, it's going to be really hard to tell a story where, and it's not to say you can't have a happy ending too, but you can have people survive. You can have like a quote unquote good outcome, but the survivors are going to be fundamentally scarred, fundamentally changed by that. And I think the story owes it to those characters to honor their experience, to honor that change. Because when it doesn't, I don't know, it just doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel real. I'm trying to think, so like Alien versus Aliens, Aliens to me isn't even really a horror movie. I'm not typically that kind of person either. Like I think horror is a big wide umbrella, but that, that is a very conservative story arc. And I mean, they literally put together the family unit at the end of the movie, right? And you're cheering, but there's no cheering in horror. I cheer too when Sigourney kicks ass at the end of the movie. So I mean, it's an action movie. It's not a horror movie. But Alien, where she's literally, even though she defeats, I mean, it's sort of a happy ending, defeats the alien. She's, at the end of that movie, she's as alone, as cosmically alone as you could be, with the knowledge that most of us are as weak. Weaker than a kitten, right? The cat outlived most of her crew. I mean, that's a horrifying ending. Anyway, but does that go towards a little bit more what you were asking about?
Yeah, absolutely. Because we often talk about, Stephen King has a lot of, and then they all live happily ever after feels to it. But the ones that stick with me the most, The Shining, Misery, are the ones where, we're reminded, yeah, they may have survived, but did they really survive? And so that makes me happy that we're on the same page with that. So when the class that we teach here at Trinity meets a creative expression requirement, and so students are writing sometimes period for the first time, but a lot of them are writing horror for the first time. So what do you think are some of the sort of key elements to writing successful horror that you would just tell anyone, no matter what stage they're at, to kind of stick to or think about?
I'm laughing because on my list, people are listening, I wrote down a list and I just wrote key elements, ? I never answered it. I mean, for writers that are first starting, I would tell them to not be afraid to not be afraid to take like a kernel of something from something that they've really liked. Like if they're not sure what to do, like it's okay to go to another movie as a starting point. Or, because I mean, I think every artist starts off on some level as a mimic, whether it's music. I'm still in the mimic music stage. I play guitar. Then at a certain point, you kind of hope that your personal experience, which is unique, sort of takes over and changes the story. But I don't know. I think we've discussed some of the key elements. I think if you can, I think I wish just more horror writers would just trust their readers more, like that they would trust them, that they've seen and read many horror things, and try not to just like cynically try to slip the same thing under their noses again. Or if you're going to give them the same sort of plot story, then something has to be different with the characters. And I don't know, sometimes that can be fun, even as an exercise. Like, hey, you have to take this sort of rote plot thing, and for me, I always go characters first. Like if I get a story idea, I typically know the beginning and the end. The end might be a little foggy, but I sort of know where I want to end up. And then it's like the whole middle swath, whether it's a novel or a short story, I have to make up. And for me, that's where I really go to the characters. I don't know, and steal characters. When I say steal, like from people all the characters, so many of them start with either like the physical characteristics of someone I know, or or a name, or something like that. So I don't know, key elements. I'm not really answering this question very well. That's why I teach math and not writing.
No, I think you're doing a fantastic job. So speaking of stealing names, was it something like on your bucket list that you would have a character named after yourself that you could kill off? Like
Yeah, poor Paul. He's 5'8" though. 5'10", that character, and I'm 6'4", so
Oh, okay.
that's why I've been saying he's clearly not me. No, the novel I'm working on now, I'm I'm full on leaning into like autobiographical stuff. It's being written as a fake memoir of someone who's probably me, but writing the memoir under a sort of a ridiculous name. So that's been sort of a different experience because I am taking a character and I'm purposely using many things that have happened to me, but it's also like really exaggerated and it's not me at the same time. So it's kind of fun. I usually don't say that about writing, which probably means it sucks. Because usually the things I write, it's just I'm not having a fun time when I'm writing it. I love being done. That's what I'm addicted to. I love having like the novel finished. For me, that's the high, being able to show it to a few people. But while I'm writing it, oh no, it's work. It's hard.
So good to hear.
Yeah, it's good to hear that it's not just difficult for us.
Yeah, no.
On a bit of a more slightly fun note, I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about just a random person, a hypothetical situation here. Who would you want to collaborate with in the horror industry, either living or dead, and why?
I mean, there's so many, so I can't, again, I'm not going to give you one. Living, I would go with my really good friend, John Langan. We've sort of talked about maybe doing it, but it's hard because, we're both so busy. But I would love to write with John. One, like, because the secret to collaborating with somebody is they have to be better than you, which is easily the case with John. And I think it would be interesting because his style and mine are so different. It could be kind of interesting to see what happened. I co-wrote a novel with Stephen Graham Jones once, a young adult novel. It's called The Floating Boy and the Girl Who Couldn't Fly, for a small independent publisher under the name P.T. Jones. We just sort of smushed our names together. And that was a lot of fun. I think Stephen's, at least, sentence level, Stephen and me have a similar style at times. So that wasn't too hard. The hardest part for me was though, Stephen just writes so damn fast. Like I would write 2 weeks on a chapter and I'd send it back to him. He'd send it back to me the next day. I'm like, Stephen, you're killing me. Also alive, very much alive. It's Clive Barker's birthday, so I kind of have to choose Clive Barker. I don't think he gets enough credit for influence. Like maybe it's partly because he went like a whole bunch of years without writing a whole lot. But, after reading King and more, and Peter Straub is certainly a formative influence of mine, but with Clive, he was like the first time I really felt unsafe reading something. Like, just from a sense of imagination, but also like this guy could do anything, and I don't know what he's going to do, and I just felt really unsettled by like I had no chance of guessing what was going to happen. For Dead, Shirley Jackson, although I have a sense, she would probably I don't know how much I would be able to write that Shirley just wouldn't take over and do a much better job with. And similar to John, like Roberto Bolaño, he probably wouldn't have any patience to work with a schlub like me, but I'd love to, if he was alive, come on, Roberto, let's do a short story together.
Speaking a little bit about, I don't know if you're able to talk about this, and I don't know at what point in development these projects are, but I was wondering if you could talk maybe about the upcoming collaborations with the film versions of A Head Full of Ghosts and The Cabin at the End of the World. By the way, congratulations. That's so exciting.
Thanks. Thank you. So yeah, I can't say a whole lot, although I mean, A Head Full of Ghosts is the closest. It's been close. Like they come really close a few times. I think if COVID hadn't happened, besides all the people that would have, lived and been much happier, A Head Full of Ghosts probably would have filmed this summer. So we'll see. I'm hopeful that, if things get better and movies can start filming, they might start filming it at some point. They have a director, Scott Cooper, and they have some casting, including Margaret Qualley to play adult Mary. So fingers crossed that happens. I'm really not much of a collaborator. Like I have no say in anything. I haven't worked on the screenplays at all. I'm not quite sure what's happening with The Cabin at the End of the World at the moment. Hopefully I get to make an announcement soon with whom, but it looks like Survivor Song is going to be optioned as well. So which is cool. So we'll see.
Congratulations.
Thanks.
That's so
Thanks.
exciting.
Yeah.
one of the things that I admire, so I'm a very fast reader, and I find myself reading really quickly, and I'm like, no, slow down and appreciate the beautifully constructed sentences he's giving us. You have an amazing sort of way with language. Is there, if you right now on the spot, could you pick one favorite word?
No. Well, it's funny. When I was thinking about this question, I was like, oh, like, what's the word that I use way too much? I take it back. My favorite word is dowsing, like dowsing for water. Like, used to have people, ever heard of that? Like, people are like, oh, I have a stick and I can find where water is in the ground. Yeah, it's such a weird thing. I like the word. So I've used it in a few stories, like as a metaphor or a simile, like, dowsing for something.
Is it the sound that you like, or is it the action, like the idea of it, or both?
I think it's more, the sound is pleasing, but I think it's more just for me, the image of an actual dowser with the sticks. I remember as a kid, I used to look for a dowsing stick. Yeah, I'm glad I remembered that.
It's a great word.
That is an incredible word, and I love the dowsing rods that they have as well. Dowsing rod is also a fun phrase to say.
Dowsing rod, yeah. Is it cellar door? It almost is. I think it is.
Coming soon to a new horror novel near you.
So what is one thing that if you could, sort of whisper into your readers' ears while they're getting ready to start reading your books, one of your books, or maybe while they're reading it, like, what do you wish that you could kind of just be like, hey, there's something I want you to think about? Like, what would you say to them?
Oh, I would have to put my arm around them and talk to them for a good long time. So, I don't know. I initially wrote down, because I did think about this one, like, it was hard hard not to just like write like paragraphs, but like, I don't know, maybe, don't be in a rush to see what happens next, because I don't write those kind of books. Although I guess Survivor Song sort of comes close to being sort of a, big plot, driven by plot kind of story. I don't know. I mean, because that reflects my favorite kind of books. Like, plot is like much lower on my list of interests as a reader compared to character and mood and voice. And then plot for me is probably fourth. If I had a few drinks and I was feeling really sort of cheeky, especially in regard to the three novels that, play with ambiguity, I would probably say, when you're done with the book, you need to ask yourself and be honest with yourself as to why you're upset with an ambiguous ending. Because I have theories. I have theories about why. Obviously not everybody, because I can't paint everybody in the same brush. But I don't know. I think I'll say it. Damn it. I don't know. I do think, there's something about sort of the dominant Christian culture in the United States in particular that makes it difficult for a lot of readers to deal with ambiguity. Because, in all three of those books, really the larger ambiguous question that hangs over everything, besides the fact that, hey, ambiguity really sort of reflects our state of memory. Our memories are a lot more malleable than we like to believe they are. Our identities are a lot more malleable, even our existence. I think any sort of ambiguity left hanging, I think, to me, automatically reflects to the ultimate ambiguous question at the end of all of our lives: what happens when we die? And we don't know. I'm sorry, you don't know. You could believe you know something, but at the core of it, you actually really don't know. And I think for a lot of readers, they can't handle that. I understand why. I'm not saying, I don't know. I think it's maybe something that some people just don't want to reflect on. I get that, but I don't know, as a horror writer and as a worst case scenario sort of person, those are the kind of things I tend to think about. So, yeah.
And we've talked about that a lot, Anthony and I have, because I'm not usually a fan of ambiguous endings, but I'm usually not a fan because I think that the writers are cheating, right? That they're saying reach into the grab bag and whatever you pull out is the source of horror. That's what it is. And I never felt that way in any of your, quote, ambiguous horrors. Like, I felt like you knew what was in the bag, whether or not we pulled out something that was expected or not might be a whole different situation. But I just,
Right.
I think that's my big thing, is that I need the author to not have an answer, but to know that he or she has made it ambiguous on purpose. So.
Right. No, I mean, and listen, I totally get it, especially in a novel. It's hard to ask readers to read 300 pages and then maybe not have an answer to, you know, at least plot wise, the central question. But, you know, as we sort of talked about, you know, and certainly like there are plenty of bad ambiguous endings, as you said. It can just feel like the author is like, I'm not sure. Or there isn't a reason, or it isn't a part of, you know, it isn't a part of the thematic why of the story. Like A Head Full of Ghosts, to me, what is one of the most horrific parts is that, you know, that central ambiguous, you know, the ambiguity to me is the book. Like that's the story. You know, and with the ending, I feel like I tried to restate sort of the central premise, the original question of whether or not something supernatural is happening. And the whole book, it starts there, but then you get all this data, you get all these 0 and 1s. So I'm going to go mathy for a minute. You know, so really it feels like there's all these other questions. And then I don't know, I almost like restating almost like getting to restate oh my God, I'm losing my mind. Restate sort of the purpose of the book, you know, toward the end. But, you know, so that book and Cabin, really quickly, the ambiguous, I approach it somewhat differently, or a little bit differently, I think, just insofar as with, you know, because people ask me all the time, is there an ending to this book? You know, or what did you imagine the ending was? Like, well, with Head Full of Ghosts, there is none. Like, honestly, I tell people, I purposely tried to build the scale so, you know, the sides of there's something supernatural going on or there's not something supernatural going on. And yeah, if something supernatural going on, there's a few other options, I suppose. But to me, that's like the central scale. It's like, I don't know. I purposely tried to divorce myself from that, that question. Not that it's not important. You know, I think it's kind of cool to think about. But with Cabin, I mean, I kind of approached it the same way and trying to build the case for both. But with Cabin at the End of the World, it was a little bit different. It became, for me, as a writer, and I guess maybe not so for a lot of readers, that the ending, it wasn't important to me if the world was going to end or not. Or to me, in my mind's eye, the story became about Eric and Andrew's choice. What was the choice they're going to make? That became the novel, as opposed to A Head Full of Ghosts, where the ambiguity was the central core of it. So, you know, when people ask about the ending of that book, I tell them, and this is 100% honest, I have not thought 1 nanosecond past the last line of that book. Anyway, wow, that was a big ramble. I told you guys before we started that I ramble.
I mean, no, I'm soaking it up, and I can tell Anthony is too. He's got like his thinking face on big time.
Oh yeah, I'm gonna be thinking about these responses for days to come. I can just tell you that now.
All right.
Moving on to our final question. This is our last one that we have time for. I was just wondering if, looking back at yourself as a young writer, what advice would you give to that young Paul Tremblay?
Oh boy, I mean, like, you know, like, I mean, there were so many small mistakes along the way, but I don't know, there was value in learning it. So I don't know if I would necessarily tell young Paul to avoid all those mistakes. But I would tell him, we sort of talked about this a little bit, that tell him that, you know, don't dream like, oh, I'm going to get to a point where it's just going to be easy and I'm just going to be able to knock out all this stuff. It doesn't get easier. And I hope that's both like frustrating and sort of a little bit of a bomb. And, you know, now that I'm here, I'm sort of, look, I want it to be easier, but I'm also sort of glad, because I think if I felt like it was easy, I think I wouldn't, if I thought it was easy, then I think that would mean that I'm not pushing myself in some way. So, you know, I never want to feel that way about it. I don't know, because it's still like, for so many writers, like I still have a day job that if anyone's listening, I hope to quit at some point, but soon. But, you know, for so many people, so many of us, it's a sacrifice to write. Like, unless it's your day job, like you're sacrificing is something as, I mean, and this isn't little, it's something as little as like watching a movie that you want to watch. But, you know, so many of us are sacrificing maybe, you know, not, you know, I try, you know, I'm first and foremost, I'm a husband and a father as well, you know, so I don't try to take time away from that. But, you know, I'd be lying if I said if it didn't happen on some points. So I don't know if I'm going to sacrifice some parts of my life that I enjoy, then it better damn well be worth it. So I guess I'm sort of glad it's hard, although I really wish it was easy too.
The duality.
Yeah, the ambiguity of everything I say, I guess.
Well, thank you so much. From the moment that we first started talking, from the moment that you liked one of our social media moments, and then, Anthony and I did happy dances, and then I remembered that social media isn't as terrible as I think it is most of the time, to now, it's just been so neat to get to talk with you, because we've been not just moved by your works, but we've been forcing it upon others so that they can also be moved by it, because I think you're where horror needs to be right now. So thank you so very much.
No, that's very kind of you. Thank you. This was a lot of fun. And no, please, thank you for, obviously I'd heard that you guys been teaching some of these, in classes. So, that was just exciting. And I'd heard about your podcast, I think, because you guys used a paper that someone who had contacted me had written about a head full of ghosts. Like he showed me his paper a few years ago. I was like, hey, they're talking about my paper. It's like, you should listen to it. So I did. And I don't know, you guys are obviously, super smart, and I enjoyed just how much energy and thought you put into the book. So, please, thank you on multiple fronts.
Thank you again. I want to say it as well. I want to make sure that my thanks is going to you as well.
Noted.
So in the meantime, is there anything you want to plug? Anything you want to get out to our listeners?
Also Survivor Song came out in July. Also sort of weird, I'm not quite sure why they did it, but the same day Survivor Song came out, the paperback of Growing Things and Other Stories came out. So if you like short stories, hopefully, and if you've read A Head Full of Ghosts, there are a couple of stories that have connections to that novel. So
I know that we both just got that one, so we look forward to reading that.
All right.
In the meantime, to our listeners, feel free to share our podcast with your friends. Give us a like. Our social medias are in the description. And in the meantime, thank you so much again, Paul, for joining us. And thank you, everybody else, for tuning in.
Thank you, Katie and Anthony.